In 1977, I would have been 16 years old. I was raised on the west side of Columbus, Ohio, and I was raised there with my mother and my father, no brothers or sisters. It was just me and them. And it was a dysfunctional situation. My mother and father were both alcoholics. My mother and father were both mentally ill. They had been diagnosed. My mother was diagnosed probably schizoaffective disorder, borderline personality disorder. Not really sure what all of her diagnoses would have been. She had been in the mental hospital many a times, put up in a mental ward. My father had to be committed at least a couple times, and he had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. So with the alcohol and things, it made for a, very abusive and dysfunctional home life. And when I was in the 10th grade, I was in high school. I was in the last period of my class day, and it was ninth period. And it was, we were getting ready to go home. It was electronics class. And there was a knock, and somebody came and said that they needed to talk to me. So I came to the door, and I was speaking to one of the student workers from the office there. And I can still remember it, standing in that hall. It seemed really kind of dark now that I think about it in the hall. I don't think the lights were on. It was a little dark. And I remember I was taller than her, and I was looking down at her. And I can still hear her saying in my ears, we got a call, and your house is on fire. And I said, we've been getting some prank calls and things like that. And I said, I don't think that's probably true. I said, let me go to the office and I'll call my mom. She should be home. So I called home, and I didn't get any answer. And so I called the neighbor across the street, and one of the girls that lived there answered the phone. And I remember she said to me almost immediately, she said, oh, I feel so sorry for you. I can still hear her saying that. Oh, I feel so sorry for you. And so I said what was going on, and she said, your house is on fire. And so I ran all the way home, which was a fairly long distance. We lived from the high school. And I remember running up the street, and there was a crowd gathered, and there was, the police, and there was the firemen there, and they were still there, making sure the fire was completely out and things. And we had in the living room, we had a big picture window that faced the front yard, and they had broke that window, throwing our furniture that obviously had been on fire out into the front yard. There was snow all over the ground. And I remember there was news media there, and there was a news camera. They put my face. Here I was, this 16-year-old kid. They had put this camera in my face, and then I still remember it was a woman reporter. And she was staying there on her sidewalk by the fire, and she walked up to me. I still remember, she says, it's pretty shocking, isn't it? And I said, yes. And I don't know what else she asked me about it or whatever. And I answered a few questions. And then I remember walking up the steps and saying to the firemen, my mom was supposed to be home here. And they said, no, we didn't find anybody. And so then a man in a suit and tie, obviously not dressed like one of the firemen, came and got me and took me in the house. And the house was it was unbelievable to see. I just left that morning to go to school. And now here it was, charred, and things that weren't burnt were melted. And it was just awful. It was a mess. It obviously was not going to be livable. And this man in this suit, who later I take it was some type of fire marshal, I didn't know at the time, took me back into my mother and father's back bedroom and shut the door. And I still remember him standing there with his notepad in his hand and his pencil, and he looked at me and said, "Has there been problems here?" Now, I had been trained, and in fact, I had been actually threatened by my mother that I was never supposed to tell what was going on in that house. In fact, my mom had a brother that had to be locked up as a young boy, probably about 10, 11 years old, had to be locked up because he had become violent. And there was this place, in fact, we used to go visit, and my mom would threaten me that if I told what was going on in the house, that she would have me locked up where Charles was. That was her brother. So when this guy asked me this, I gave him the standard answer that I had learned and had been drilled into my head, that no, there was no problems here. Well, not too awful long after that, they had finally gotten a hold of my father at work, and I can still remember standing on the steps and my dad walking up, obviously in shock, and just could not believe it. I can still see he was like a deer caught in the headlights, looking up at what happened. And then again, this same man in this suit and tie took me and my father to the back bedroom and again, and shut the door. And I remember I was probably sitting on a chair. My father was standing up facing him. And the man asked, he says, "Has there been any problems here?" And I remember my dad looked down at me and then looked up at him and said, "Yeah, there's been some problems here." And so come to find out what had happened is my mother had set a fire to every room of our house and took an overdose of pills. It wasn't the first time she'd ever taken an overdose of pills or tried to kill herself. But obviously it was the first time she ever burnt down the house. Set each room of the house on fire, took an overdose of pills, and was going to burn herself up with it. But at the last minute, she ran out of the house and left it and took off up the street to Sullivan Avenue and was headed to the hospital. We was probably about 10 miles from the hospital or so, something like that. And she was headed to the hospital. She was trying to save herself. And what eventually happened, she fell over into a snowdrift and would have died. But along come God, it was only God, in the form of an ambulance, and found her and picked her up and took her to the hospital. We had been looking for her to find out what happened to her, and we got a report that she was at the hospital. So we ended up at the hospital, and I can remember my father taking me into the bathroom and telling me that my mom, the doctor said she was in a coma and that her belly was full of pills and that her lungs were full of smoke and that he didn't know whether she was going to come out of it or not. And my dad was bawling like a baby. I remember I tried to comfort him, but he didn't want me. We didn't have any kind of real contact or anything. I remember walking out of that bathroom and feeling so alone. And I remember saying to his family that was there, I said, "You ought to get," and my grandmother, which was my father's mother, I said, "You ought to get her," because I said he's probably going to need somebody, but I knew there wasn't nothing that I could do for him. And there wasn't nothing he was going to do for me. It would be later she would come out of the coma. And I still remember when she first came out of the coma that we stood by her bed. She reached up to grab my hand, and I had all these mixed emotions and feelings and stuff. And I wasn't allowed to, display them, or wasn't allowed to give in to them. And of course, that's the way abuse goes in a family many times, is that you're not allowed to feel, you're not allowed to show any emotion or anything, because it will make the abuser feel mad or feel bad or upset. And so I remember going out into the hall and sitting down and just weeping for the first time and just sobbing, not knowing which way to turn. A gentleman that my father worked with at the electric company where he worked at the time had allowed us to live in a townhouse that he owned, and we lived there for about a year before my father and mother were able to get back on their feet, which they did. My mother ended up living to be 80-some years old. But anyway, we lived in that townhouse, and somewhere in the midst of all that, my mother was in the hospital. She was in the mental ward of the hospital. We didn't know whether they were going to put her. There was talk they may put her into prison for what she had done, or that they were going to commit her. In fact, I was told later by my father that the psychiatrist who she had been seeing, and they both had been seeing for many years, wanted her to just go ahead and be committed to the state hospital now. And my dad talked him out of it, is what he did. And so we didn't know whether she was going to be committed to the state hospital for the rest of her life or going to be put in prison for burning the house down. We didn't know. We didn't know where we was going to live. We didn't know how anything was going to work out. My mother was in the mental hospital. My father was drinking and working and doing what he could and everything, and I was alone. And I remember that somehow, I don't remember how, I got a hold of a track, a gospel track. It was one of those chick tracks that had a, it was like a comic book. It was a little track. And I remember that it didn't have any writing in it, but what it had in it had the crucifixion and Jesus dying on the cross. And then I remember at the end of the track, it showed this girl and this boy kneeling at the cross and the blood of Jesus washing away their sins. And I remember I prayed that prayer. I was just a 16-year-old kid. Didn't know anything about God, really. Didn't know anything about anything. Wasn't going to church, raised in this abusive home. In this situation, I didn't know what was going to happen. But God found me. Glory. Praise his name. God found me. And God set me free. And he washed me. And I was changed. I remember that there was a little creek that was near that townhouse, and I would take this little Bible that I found. Didn't even know how to read it. Didn't even know what it was about. But I would walk down to that creek, and I'd sit there on a log, and I would just look at the woods and look at the creek, and I would talk to God, and God became so real to me, and he would meet with me. And he was so wonderful to meet with me. This 16-year-old kid that was confused, and his life had been turned upside down, but now was turned upside down worse than it ever had. And God took me in his arms, and God was so precious, and God was so good, and God was so kind and loving and compassionate to me. That's the kind of God we serve. I hope you have a great day. God bless you.